Americans for Prosperity North Dakota proudly supported important policy improvements that broke barriers for all North Dakotans this legislative session. From tackling unnecessary and burdensome occupational licensing standards to fighting for tax relief, AFP is proud to have played a part in improving the lives of North Dakotans this year. Join AFP today by visiting www.afpnd.org. This advertisement was paid for by Americans for Prosperity. Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. A little bit later in the show, we're going to have an interview with Senator Kevin Cramer, where he takes some listener questions and also responds to some of this controversy over his relationship with Fisher Sand and Gravel. They're an organization, a North Dakota-based organization that wants to build the border wall. There was a big report over the weekend suggesting that there was some untoward connection between the politics of the owners of this business and Senator Cramer and President Trump and the owners' appearances on Fox News and all that stuff. You'll hear Senator Cramer talk about that a little bit later in the show. Before we get there, can we talk about how sometimes the free market can address things better than public policy can? Now, in North Dakota, we've struggled with drunk driving for a long time, and I think there's probably a couple of reasons why. For one, we're a drinking state. Historically, a lot of the immigrants that came to North Dakota that make up the majority of the population these days came from cultures where drinking was very much of just a part of society. I'm talking about Germans. I'm talking about Scandinavians. I'm talking about Russians. To this day, North Dakotans like to drink, and we drink a lot. Now, you couple that with the fact that we live in a place with a lot of long roads home. It's a very long, our communities are very spread out. Our communities are very rural, and there's not a lot of ways to get home if you can't drive. You could get a ride with a friend, but if it's a friend that's at the bar with you at 1 o'clock in the morning, well, that friend may not be suitable to drive either. There's not a lot of public transportation, and, taxi services and the like don't always supply. It's not always a good option. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've tried to get a ride from a taxi in North Dakota at bar close time, and, well, it's not an easy thing to do. You end up waiting a long time. Enter, however, the rideshare services. Now, North Dakota's larger communities, where most of our state's residents live, now have access to services like Uber, services like Lyft. And you have to wonder, is that going to have an impact on North Dakota's drunk driving statistics? Well, here's an anecdote. It's not scientific. It doesn't necessarily prove anything one way or the other, but here's an anecdote which suggests that, well, maybe it's having a very good effect. In fact, a very measurable effect, a very large effect. I'm going to read you now from the Bismarck Tribune. I quote, Bismarck Police Department's 2018 crime and traffic report showed a drop in drunk driving arrests. A statistic Chief Dave Drayovich is pleased to see. That category fell by more than 35%, going from 590 in 2017 to 380 in 2018. Drayovich said he had several people read the report before its release, and that statistic drew many comments. They're out and about, and they see a lot more cars sitting in the parking lots the next morning, Drayovich said. He said he didn't have proof, but that might mean people are more often using ride services to get home. If that's the case, man, that is great. That's exactly what we want, he said. I agree with him. That is exactly what we want. I think sometimes we have a tendency to look at DUI enforcement as a hammer and nail problem, right? Drunk driving is the problem, and law enforcement is, drunk driving is the nail, and law enforcement is the hammer. And so we're just using law enforcement to bash the nail. And the way we've been trying to solve this from the perspective of public policy is tougher penalties for drunk driving, tougher civil penalties, right? Because when you get a DUI, there are two proceedings against you. There is a civil proceeding against your driving privileges, and then there is a criminal proceeding against you for your misconduct. And both of those, we have made it more severe. We have lowered the, BAC limit. I don't know that any of that has really made that much of an impact. We've even got like a 24/7 sobriety program. So people who are repeat offenders or people who get particularly severe DUIs. They have to like show up at a law enforcement office and blow into a breathalyzer twice a day to ensure that they're not drinking around the clock, or they have to wear like an ankle monitoring bracelet. I mean, suffice it to say, we've put a lot into enforcement of drunk driving, and I don't know that a lot of it has really made a difference, except what seems to be making a difference. And again, this is not scientific, and again, these ride services haven't been around for a long time, but at least based on this anecdote in Bismarck and based on what Chief Dreyevich in Bismarck apparently believes, it sure seems like, given the opportunity to not drive drunk, given the opportunity to find a safe ride home that's easy, that you could just summon a ride, and it's easy, it's relatively quick, and get home safe, people are choosing that. And I think there's an important lesson there. Sometimes the carrot looks better than the stick. We look at public policy a lot of times, and especially public policy when it's dealing with criminal activity or irresponsible activity, and we take this sort of throw the book at them approach. We do that all up and down the criminal code, to the point where, nationally we have a problem with, prison overcrowding. We have an incarceration rate in the United States of America that's worse than communist China's. It's not a good thing. And I think a lot of it stems from that attitude, that hammer and nail attitude. The problem is the nail, law enforcement's the hammer, let's just whack it. And when it comes to drunk driving, it may turn out law enforcement wasn't the solution. Maybe more drastic punishments weren't the solution. Maybe the solution was just giving the people who are out drinking, most of whom, by the way, are not problem drinkers, are just social drinkers, but it doesn't take many social drinks. You can drink responsibly and still be too drunk to drive. If we're giving those sort of people an easy way to get home, then they're going to take it. And it makes me wonder, I mean, obviously it took private sector investment and it took technological advancements, with apps and smartphones and everything to make ride service companies like Uber, like Lyft, to make them work. And that's not really something the government could do. But I've long argued that, the better way to solve drunk driving is to just give the people who have been drinking a safe ride home. Maybe instead of arresting people all the time, find a way to get them home safe. I thought shuttle services and the like. To me, I felt like our time could have been better spent instead of hiring more cops to do more DUI enforcement and arrest more people and put more people in the court system. Instead of doing all of that, if we could just find a way to get them home at the end of the night, that would be a lot easier. And that would be a lot more cost effective, and we wouldn't have, a lot of the other issues going on with our courts and a lot of the other expenses to the taxpayers. I mean, just think of some of the money that we're spending on arresting and adjudicating all of these drunk driving cases. If we instead shifted that to just, hey, let's find a safe way to get people home, we would probably have a bigger impact. We would probably have fewer drunk drivers on the road. In fact, again, that seems to be what's happening in Bismarck. With a better ride home available, fewer people are driving drunk. Seems like a good thing to me. And maybe an inkling, maybe an idea for future public policy discussions, instead of it always being about seeing how many people we can arrest, right? Measuring the problem. And that's, by the way, that is something, and if you are a longtime reader of Say Anything blog, if you've been listening to this podcast, you've probably heard me rant about this before, but it drives me nuts when we use DUI arrests as a measure of the drunk driving problem. I don't think that that's really the right statistic to look at. We want to look at how many people are getting hurt, how many people are getting killed, how many accidents are happening, how much property is being damaged. Those are the measures that we want. Because the whole point of this isn't to see how many people we can arrest. It's not to see how many people we can put in jail. You're not even necessarily solving the problem. For years now, we have seen drunk driving arrests go up and down, and they don't really seem to have had much of an impact on the drunk driving problem. But ride sharing services come along, and suddenly it sure seems like we're having an impact. It sure seems like there's a lot fewer drunk drivers on the road, and that's a positive thing. That's what we want. That was the whole point. And we were able to accomplish it without putting a lot of people through the criminal justice system, without embarrassing a lot of people, without arresting them and having all the extra costs associated with that. It's a good thing. We'll see what happens with these long-term trends. I have a feeling, and maybe I'll be wrong, but I have a feeling that where these ride-sharing programs are available, we are going to start seeing sharp declines in drunk driving arrests as they're adopted. I hope it's right. I could be wrong. And if I am right, though, again, there's a lesson for that for public policy. My interview with Senator Kevin Cramer up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Joining me now is Senator Kevin Cramer as he joins me most weeks. Sometimes we have to move the schedule around a little bit because of holidays or different scheduling things, but he's on. We're recording this on Friday. Normally we do these on Wednesdays, Wednesdays, and they publish on Thursdays, but just moving things around a little bit. Remember, if you want to submit questions for these segments, you can certainly do that. Rob@sayanythingblog.com is the place to send those, or on social media. I solicit questions every week, so you can certainly send in your questions if you're following me on social media. And why the heck wouldn't you be following me on social media? You certainly should be. Kevin, how you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for accommodating my schedule. It was really the Defense Authorization Act all-day markup in the committee that threw us off, so I appreciate you accommodating.
Well, let's talk about that, because Sci-Fi Nerd Rob's been grilling you about the Space Force every week. I don't know if anybody else cares about it, but I think it's needed. I think we've spent too long thinking of space as we're moving to a point where this is needed. It's a real pragmatic need on a number of fronts. And also, I think there's a real opportunity for North Dakota specifically and our military installations here, and maybe new military installations to be built. I don't know, but it seems like there's a real opportunity for North Dakota to be a part of this. Was that part of the defense markup? Was that part of the proceeding there?
It was, but it was not without some controversy. In the markup, in what's known as the chairman's mark, that's the base bill that's basically the staff of the majority and minority build together. It's sort of the lowest common denominator. They included Space Force, but they didn't have the type of leadership structure that would give it the prominence that I believed it needed, or that the president believes it needs. And so I had to offer up some amendments. I did offer up some amendments, 3 of them to be exact. One that required a standalone commander. The base bill had the commander being the commander of Space Command and Space Force. Space Command is, a different agency. And then it also it had the commander answering directly to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force rather than the Secretary of the Air Force. That's very significant in terms of attracting talent and upward mobility in the force. And then the third thing was it had the base bill had the commander as a situational member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. My amendment made them a permanent member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, equal to the Commandant of the Marine Corps. It's the Marine Corps, being a part of the Navy, that's the model that the president chose for the Space Corps, the Space Corps, even though at the very, very beginning, his intention was that he wanted it to be a complete standalone, division of the military, its own force altogether, just like the Army, Air Force, and Navy. And he still wants that. Actually, he called me yesterday morning to thank me for the effort and the work on it, and but said he still hopes that someday it would grow into its own force. And it is opportunistic, perhaps, for North Dakota because of the assets that we have both at Grand Forks and Minot. In fact, I think they're sort of perfect for it. But also, with our ICBM missiles in particular, space is a domain where the Chinese and the Russians are paying a lot to play, and they are advancing much quicker than we are. We still dominate, but they're advancing much quicker than we are, and they've made the type of commitment that we are now making in this Defense Authorization Act. So yeah, I think it's important for security, and my colleagues agreed. We passed all of the amendments, as I said, and they're all now in the bill that will go to the Senate floor.
Is there a lot of bipartisan support for this? Because it seems like there's a lot of eye rolling on the parts of Democrats. And I don't know how much of that is just sort of knee jerk. It's President Trump's idea, therefore we don't like it. I mean, sometimes though, I think you guys get in these committee hearings and some pragmatism once nobody's really paying attention and the news cameras are elsewhere. There's some pragmatism which emerges. Is there bipartisan support for this?
Yeah, it's a good question, Rob. There is, but the support for Space Force, it varies just member to member, really. There's some skepticism, varying degrees of skepticism about what it should look like. There's all kinds of interest, however, and I want to be fair to my Democratic colleagues. I mean, they all agree with space as a war domain, a fighting domain that we want to be dominant in. I mean, when you think of the low orbiting satellites that do our GPS for us as we're traveling, that do our, operate our cell phones. There's a lot, not to mention our entire communication system for the military. There's a lot at stake in space, not to mention hypersonic missiles, which, can in some cases come from space, or in many cases go into space and come back, go into orbit before coming down, and they're not detectable if you don't have the right stuff in space. So this is really important domain. Nobody denies that. It's just varying degrees. I do think most Democrats oppose, well, all of the Democrats in the committee oppose my amendments, two especially, that give it the prominence that I felt it needed. But I think two Democrats voted for the Defense Authorization Act with those amendments included.
Let's keep moving here. A lot of headlines right now, and I'm reading one from the Washington Post. Headline is, I quote, "He always brings them up. Trump tries to steer border wall deal to North Dakota firm." Another one from the Hill newspaper. Trump pushing for GOP donors company to get border wall contract. It seems the insinuation in a lot of these reports, and I think it's unfair because they don't come right out and say it, but there's just sort of the insinuation here that Fisher Sand and Gravel, which is certainly well known. They've been talking about the border wall for a long time, saying that they could build it. They were part of the bid process. In fact, according to a report from my colleague John Hageman, sued over the bidding process, sued the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Jay Fisher has been on Fox News. He's been very prominent about it. I'm sure he's been on other media outlets as well, but Fox News is the one everybody's talking about. You've been talking about this. You've been critical of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. You've talked about Fisher Sand and Gravel being somebody who could definitely build this wall and do a good job of it. Now President Trump is talking about Fisher Sand and Gravel. So I guess the insinuation is that, President Trump picked them, and this is just politics. Fisher's, it's a Republican, it's a firm owned by Republicans, and they've given money to your campaign. Maybe they've donated to President Trump. I guess I don't know.
I don't know either.
They're saying that this is politics. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, good for politics if it is. Second, I'm tired of apologizing for people's activism, people supporting politicians who support the same goals as they do. I mean, that is what America's, self-governance experiment is all about. And I bristle every time the Washington Post or CNN or somebody suggests that politicians do what donors want them to do, rather than donors expressing their support by supporting politicians who share their values. I just reject that out of hand. Secondly, I don't know that Fisher is a big donor to Trump or a donor at all. He's a maximum donor to me, which is I think in the last election was $2,700. Him and $2,700 from his wife for $5,400. So all of that after I was already advocating for them, and I don't apologize for advocating for them. They are my constituents. But I want to be really clear about something else, and that is I've never suggested that Fisher should be the company that builds the wall. My complaints have always been about the Corps of Engineers and their process, which I think is highly suspicious. They do RFPs that don't even ask for a price. They ask, if they've had experience building the wall in the last 5 years, which, pretty much blocks out everybody except the company that's been building the wall for the last 5 years. And it's antiquated, it's old, it's bureaucratic. So Fisher has made his own way by doing things like a lot of media, by shooting a lot of video, by sharing a lot of information. And yes, I've been to his plants in Arizona and in Dickinson. I knew Gene Fisher, Tom's dad, and I've driven their equipment and demonstrated how easy it is to do the job that they say they can do. And he is a pre-qualified bidder on these projects. The Department of Homeland Security did a pre-qualification of companies that are big enough to do it, that have done large horizontal projects of $100 million or more. Fisher's done lots of those, of course. That's bonded to the tune of billions of dollars, which is really important when you talk about taxpayer dollars. So, but Rob, I had a long conversation with the president about this yesterday morning before the Washington Post interview. And even to me, he didn't advocate that say he wants Fisher to do it. He said he's concerned about the bureaucracy at the Corps of Engineers, and he likes the Fisher model. He likes Fisher from what he's seen. He's never met a Fisher. He's never met Tommy Fisher. He shook his hand after his union address on his way by, through the Capitol. But what he did is he asked me to do get in the weeds, as he put it, and look at the bidding process, the RFPs, the contracts that have been awarded, and see what I can learn, and see if there's improvements that could be made, and if there's anything to be concerned about. And that's exactly what I've been doing, and I'm going to continue to do. And I'm also checking into the ownership of these other companies that are getting the projects, because how do we know who they donate to? I wonder if the Washington Post looked that up, or who they used to work for,
Is there a concern that you create an appearance of impropriety by advocating? I mean, even though, Fisher's, they're a hometown company.
Right.
North Dakota, I think sometimes people who are from outside North Dakota forget that our state is like the size of a medium-sized city in another state, but we're in the shape of a state. And so sometimes, we're very pro North Dakota, right? We're very rah-rah. Right. If it's a North Dakota company that can do something big on the national stage, the North Dakota thing is kind of fall in line, get behind them, right? Let's get this thing done. But is there a danger in that where you're out there saying, even though you say that you haven't said that Fisher should get the job, I think it's more been along the lines of, hey, they've got a great idea, they could do a great job. Is there a danger in doing that and creating the perception that the fix is in politically, even if it's not?
Sure there is, but I feel in reality it's not perceptions. And I think that the agencies that are spending, when we sort of perception, I think places like the Washington Post should do more of that. But all of that said, Rob, I think you make a valid point. However, at this point, the frustration level has gotten to where the Corps has built 42 miles of wall, 39 of which was a replacement to auto barriers. And we've done 3 appropriations and in some emergency funding, repurposing DOD dollars, and that's all that's happened. So I think the pitch has gotten louder and louder. But I also would say this, in that Washington Post story, remember there are 4, once again, as per tradition of the Washington Post, unnamed, unattributed, snitches, if you will, leakers, supposedly from the administration, complaining that the president is pushing them toward this other company, other than what they called, they were defending these decades-old processes of procurement and contracting. Never ever dawning on them that decades-old processes might need to be reviewed every now and then, and this is why we elect our leaders as opposed to appointing them for life into a bureaucracy. And so, the Corps, like a lot of bureaucracies, need to be shaken up, and it's a pretty major reason why Donald Trump, became president of the United States and beat the swamp.
Let's talk for a minute about trade. Certainly a lot of political pressure, as we saw during the 2018 election cycle, a lot of people out there talking about China and talking about what President Trump is doing, or what his trade policies are doing to farmers and soybean farmers. there is some good news. I mean, there is an aid package coming out, although I think most people, Senator Chuck Grassley said that, we need trade, not aid. I agree with that. Yeah. In fact, I'd suggest that even though you support the aid package, you agree with it as well. But that's, I guess, some good news in the interim for the farmers to help make ends meet. The other thing is we are seeing some progress on other fronts. For instance, Japan opening their markets to American beef. Do you think those sorts of things increase our leverage with China?
They absolutely do. What decreases our leverage, what undermines the president's negotiating leverage and credibility is when Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats continue these goofy investigations, relitigating the same old, over and over again, and now talking about impeachment like it's a possibility. And those are the problems. But yes, I think that when, having these bilaterals with Japan, having Japan lift those restrictions on beef, big deal. Having Canada, Mexico, and the United States finally coming to an agreement and lifting the tariffs on the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, really big deal. All of this lends itself to momentum, which is very important, and credibility, which is very important in the negotiation with China. So yes, I do think that. I also think, by the way, that the trade aid, and I agree, I'd rather have trade than aid. I think we all agree. I think every farmer agrees with that. But even that commitment to shoring up farmers during this difficult time that is created by, forces other than themselves is further, though, lends credibility to the president's position. And that is, we're in this for the long haul, China. China with an emperor for life, they make decisions based on a 50-year horizon. We make decisions based on the next election, which is never more than 2 years away. And so the president is demonstrating that he's committed to these tools all the way through. And I think all of that lends itself to it. But boy, let me tell you, completing the USMCA would be a very big.
Well, right. I was going to ask about that because I was reading a press release from the North Dakota Democratic Party, and they're sort of echoing the national talking points about President Trump and China and the trade deal and everything, or the trade war and everything that's going on there, saying, look, we're hurting farmers and this is Republican leadership and all the points that you would expect them to make. What I'm not hearing from the North Dakota Democratic Party, and really even the National Democratic Party, is any talk about what you just referred to, the USMCA, which is the new trade deal replacing NAFTA, the new trade deal with Canada and Mexico. And I actually went and looked up. The number one market for North Dakota exports is Canada. Mm-hmm. It's not China. Right. In fact, China's not even number two. Mexico is number two, a very distant number two to Canada, but number two. And then the continent of Asia, which is the entire continent of Asia, not China, but all of Asia, is about a third of what we export to Mexico. So if we're really concerned about trade and the way trade's impacting North Dakota's economy, why don't we ratify the USMCA, especially when it seems to me, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that it's the Democratic-led House that seems to be the kind of unknown when it comes to ratifying that agreement.
Well, that's exactly right, because according to the Trade Promotion Authority that the USMCA was negotiated under, that's otherwise known as fast-track authority, the House of Representatives has to pass the ratification legislation before it can go to the Senate. And we're at that stage now in this very convoluted process of TPA authority, where the House would have to act on a bill, on legislation, within 30 days of it being introduced, and the legislation hasn't been introduced because the Speaker and the President, well, the President's been very patient with the Speaker, put it that way. She wanted to, her caucus wants to fix some things they feel before they can vote on this, and one of them was Mexico and Canada's labor laws didn't have enough meat in them. So guess what? Mexico and Canada passed new labor laws to meet that demand. So then the Democrats had to come up with another thing and say, well, we don't know that it's economically valuable. So the International Trade Commission finished their economic analysis and came out with the evidence that it's hugely valuable, that it would increase GDP by something like a third of a point, which is a lot, as we know, that it would create hundreds of thousands of new jobs, and that, in fact, the economic benefit would be greater than the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is already proven to be hugely successful and bent the debt curve by $3 trillion. And so then when it wasn't that, then it was, well, we're not going to do anything until the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum are lifted. Well, now the Trump administration has agreed with Mexico and Canada on that, and we lifted those. So really all of their objections should be gone, and it's time for them to step up to the plate. And I believe, Rob, that while it seems, like it's really tense right now, I think on this topic that 30 or 40, that group of 30 or 40 Democrats from Trump districts that hasn't said a thing since they got elected because, Speaker Ocasio-Cortez and Majority Leader Omar have been driving the agenda for the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. They're going to have to step up one of these days and say, man, we've got to do something or I'm not going to get, reelected. So, we're trying to get something done yet this summer. That's what the president wants. That's the administration. That's what we all want. We'd like to get USMCA passed this summer. And here's the other political consideration, Rob, that I think is sort of interesting. If for a lot of these Democrats that are running for the president, some of them are in the House, a bunch of them are in the Senate, the sooner they vote on this, and I think they will and they'll vote for it, the sooner they do that, the further they can remove this win for Trump from his reelection. And I think some people ought to start reminding Nancy Pelosi that, look, vote on it now, and maybe he loses some of the momentum by election day. Otherwise, you're going to be voting on it on an election year. And anyway, so you're exactly right. If they really cared about trade, they'd be promoting the USMCA. They'd be bringing it up for a vote, and they'd be sending it over to the Senate.
Speaking of the USMCA, one of some of the questions submitted dealt with that specifically. Listener Don sent a number of questions, and he wanted me to ask them. Here's the first one. I quote, "One of the grievances farmers in North Dakota and the U.S. have is the treatment of wheat shipped from North Dakota into Canada. Currently, I believe all wheat transported in that direction is graded as animal feed, and consequently the price is lower. True or false?"
That is true. They treat it as animal feed. They discriminate against American wheat.
Now, is that the status quo, or does the trade deal change that?
That's the status quo. The trade deal changes that.
Okay.
That was something that I fought for with the president himself. Talked to him about it on Air Force One. He asked me to jot it down on a note card. He read the note card at the speech that he gave. He said, "Hey, it was one of the funnier moments. He says, I don't know what the hell this means, but it doesn't sound good." And then he tossed the card, and yes, that did get changed in the USMCA. So that's a major victory for North Dakota wheat farmers.
Second question, the trade agreement specifies that in order to be graded human food, it must be provable that the variety is a Canadian variety. The varieties developed by NDSU and other U.S. researchers will still be graded as animal feed. True or false?
I don't know that. I couldn't verify that. I'd have to check that out.
All right.
I don't know.
His last question is, the trade agreement contains anti-consumer treatment of the patents on drugs. True or false?
Again, I've heard some of that, but I've not been convinced of that, Rob. But again, I couldn't speak to the details of that. But we'll get those answers real specifically. Maybe we'll post them or even send them to you to post or something like that.
Sure.
It'd be helpful because those are really good specific questions that probably can give a good succinct specific answer to.
Now I have a question from Nat on Twitter. He says, what are his thoughts on the recent abortion bills which don't provide exceptions for rape or incest? Does he think a woman should have to carry her rapist child to term? And he's got another follow-up question on trade. So I guess we'll stick with the abortion question first.
Sure. A couple of things. First of all, I just think as a political matter, I'm very pro-life. I believe that, that an aborted baby is a killed human being. But realizing where we are today, where even late-term abortion is legal and evidently even infanticide in some states is still illegal, or at least that's what Democrats want. I believe that every increment towards eliminating the death, eliminating death of unborn children is a good way to go. I think that when you do something like Alabama did in their bill, which is I think the one that he's referencing, I think it makes it very difficult to pass legitimate pro-life legislation that has a real chance of becoming law. And so I don't support that. I don't support that strategy at all. Now, that said, I will tell you that a baby that is conceived in a rape or an incest situation, that goes to full term and is born is every bit a human being as one that was conceived in another way. And there are people alive today for whom that's the case. So I think we have to be very careful to not just simply dismiss a child because of the way they were conceived. But obviously in situations like that, certainly the health of a mother's, and by the way, the Alabama law also did protect not just the life of the mother, but certain health situations of the mother. Obviously that can be considered. Well, it's always considered when there's one or the other. You have to have self-defense mechanisms, and doctors can certainly make those decisions. And I think similarly, some arguments could be made in traumatic situations like a rape or incest. So those would be more of a case-by-case basis, and we would require a lot of counseling, those kinds of things. So I guess I'd leave that out of a bill, but we still ought to be working toward life, not toward death.
His follow-up question: does China pay U.S. tariffs? Would be good to know. He knows. Would be good to know he knows how it works, considering the impacts on North Dakota agriculture.
So did he say, does China pay U.S. tariffs? Is that what he said?
Yes.
Yeah. So the way tariffs work, tariffs are a tax on products. So far, the tariffs prior to these last $200 million or $1 billion worth, the tariffs have been mostly on raw products that are used in a process. And so those tariffs have been paid for the most part by the companies, absorbed by the companies, in some cases passed on to the final product. Obviously, that's how taxes work, or any other cost. So, whether it's steel or whether it's a trinket that you buy at a convenience store, at the end of the day, the consumer buying the product is paying that tax. I mean, that's the reality of it. There's no question about it. But what that does do is it makes the Chinese-made product too expensive for people to buy and makes other countries' products more competitive. I personally hate it as an economic model, as an economic business, but China already puts tariffs on a lot of our stuff, and most other countries put a lot more tariffs on our stuff than we put on their stuff. So, as consumers, we've been getting a pretty good deal out of it, but at the same time, we've just manufacturing that, that have gone to other places as a result of it. So tariffs it's not as simple as who pays it and who gets punished. It's about the larger economic issue. I'd also add this. China has been stealing us blind. They've been stealing the last soybean. Flux right now, and it's why it's so dangerous. And Rob, if a president 10 or 20 years ago would have dealt with China, we'd all be a lot better off. But if we don't deal with China and we make a bad trade deal, or we allow them to continue to roll over us like previous Republican and Democratic presidents have done, we won't be farming our own land. I mean, the largest pork producers in the United States, or the largest pork industry in the United States, is Chinese right now. And so we've got to be very, very careful to be an America first economy while we're an open, free economy. And remembering also that for those who say that we should just not have aid at all to assist our farmers because we are free marketers, remember that this whole thing is over a dispute over free markets, because China has been illegally super subsidizing lots of the crops like corn and wheat and the rice that we produce in the United States. And that's not a free market. They've been doing it against WTO rules for years, and it's hurt our industries for years. So if we want to preserve our industries, you have to be able to fight with the tools, the weapons that they're fighting. Consumers ultimately pay that.
Well, Kevin, we're starting to have some problems with your cell phone connection, so I think we'll sign off. Have a great Memorial Day weekend, and we'll talk with you again soon.
Thanks, Rob.
That's it for today's Plain Talk Podcast. Remember, new episodes come out Monday through Friday, barring things like holidays or what have you. Most Mondays won't have a new episode because during the summer months, just the news cycle slows down a little bit. And honestly, I'll admit I'm taking it easy a little bit during the summer months. Hey, North Dakota, we only get so many nice summer days in North Dakota. So I'm going to try to enjoy some of them this year. I hope you do as well. But that'll mean maybe a few fewer podcasts over the summer. But I'm always on Mondays. I'm always on the Jay Thomas Show on WDAY. We do a little segment so you can listen to that, and I'll upload those segments to the podcast feed. If you have any feedback on the show, if you email Rob at sayanythingblog.com, that's the best way to get a hold of me. You can also follow me on social media. I'm Rob Port on Twitter and Facebook. Say Anything Blog has a Twitter and Facebook account as well, so follow those. And if you do follow me, say hi, because I like it when people say hi. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again.